We're going to be in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. We're not going to read 4 chapters, okay, I promise. Let's pick it up in chapter 6, verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And so at least some things have changed since then, right? It said, and God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. When I was a youth pastor in Ravenna for a couple of years. I was like 19 or 20. And it was right when Hurricane Katrina hit. Everyone remember Hurricane Katrina, right? And so we were able to go down. I went with our church, and we went down right where the levee had broke. Because if you don't know, so the hurricane was obviously bad, but the breaking of the levee is really what caused a lot of the devastating floods. And so we went down there to help kind of rebuild some homes. And at one time I was I don't know why, but I had a sledgehammer. You know, I was breaking something up. You know. And I was going at it, going. And I went back one time, and it flew out of my hands, the sledgehammer, just flew out of my hands. Directly behind me was everything that this lady had saved from her house. Like the window, like she had saved windows that made it, and this sledgehammer went right through them all. And so they called me Sledge for the rest of the weekend. Or the rest of the week. The thing about the hurricane, though, and the levees is that, the Dutch. So, for instance, the Dutch are also under sea level, right? And so when they built the dikes to keep the water out, they said the engineers built the dikes to withstand the worst storm in over 1,000 years, right? And so because that's probably important that you can survive the worst storm in 1,000 years, right? Well, the Army Corps of Engineers said that the levee in New Orleans was only built to withstand the worst storm in 100 years. And because of corruption and theft and lying, they didn't take care of it. They didn't do what they needed to do. And so when the storm came, the flood came, not because God wanted to flood the city, but because sin was running rampant in the community. Right, and so we can try to blame God, or we can look at the things that we're doing in life. And so I think when we read Noah, one of the things to understand is that if you allow sin to run rampant in your life, you should expect a flood. You should expect a flood. That's Romans 6, right? Romans 6:23. It's for the wages of sin is death. And so this doesn't just mean eternally, right? The sins of that city, right? The sins of the people of that city, running that city, cost the lives of a lot of people, right? Because they allowed sin to run rampant. And so that I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we can take away from Noah. So verse 14 says this: make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. When I was a teenager, does anyone remember Yahoo Answers? This is like, it was like you would ask it anything, and it just kind of had everyone would kind of give you their answers. Well, I would get on there and I would just argue with atheists as a teenager. This was my fun. This is what I did for fun. And so one of the things that was kind of with Noah, they would always say, well, there's other flood myths, right? There's everyone. And what I found out was, not only is there just a couple, like almost every ancient civilization has a flood story, right? But the interesting thing about Noah is that when you look at the other flood myths, and when I say myth, I mean like technically, right? Not like flippantly, right? Technically myth. The ark is really the only one that I could find that would actually float. like Gilgamesh, like if the Epic of Gilgamesh has a flood narrative, and he's in like a cube. Cubes don't float very well, right? There's another one, I think there's someone on a raft. They survived the flood on a raft. Someone was inside of a hollowed out log, right? So you have all these different ways, but when you look at the story of Noah, it's like we actually have something that would float, right? That would actually do the thing that it's called to do. But building ourselves an ark, I think it was, what was it? I got divorced when my kids were very little. They were probably 3 and 5, and my ex-wife became agnostic. Okay, so that's a big life change for me, right? I went from, suffice to say, right? Obviously, it's a big life change. But one of the things that I really struggled with was now my children, right? I don't know what they're being taught, right? I don't know what they're learning. And what I did find out was they started asking some really big questions, like questions that I didn't ask until I was in college, right, about God. And they're in elementary school, they're asking all these questions. So I decided at that moment I had to learn everything that I could because I wanted to have every answer to be able to just help them like understand and do these things. And so I spent probably 3 years. And it was during the rise of the new atheism. I don't know if anyone was tracking with that, but there was kind of an atheist movement, and it's kind of going down right now. And I just wanted to learn everything I could about what's called apologetics, right? And it doesn't mean to apologize. Apologetics comes from apologia, which is like in defense of, right? I think it's 1 Peter 3:15. We read it earlier. It says this: always be prepared to give an answer. Right, that's apologia. That's where we get apologetics. To everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And it's like, so I wanted to make sure that I could answer like all those questions for them. So fast forward 3 or 4 years later, I had allowed sin in my life to fester. And if you let sin fester, it grows. And it was something that I thought was no big deal, and it grew into something that wanted to destroy me and destroy my family. And if you've dealt with sin in your life, you know how it can grow and get out of hand and out of control. And I was so mad. I was in this storm, and I didn't want anything else to do with God. I said, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I don't want to do any of this stuff. I don't want to pastor, right? I don't want to do any of this stuff, God. If you even exist, you clearly don't care, right? That was my heart. The problem was I had spent 3 years building an ark, right? I had spent 3 years building an ark. And so every time I would try to justify or argue my way out of this thing, I knew that I was wrong. Right, and so one of the things that we have to understand is that we're building. We need to make sure that we're working on our faith. Philippians 2, Paul writes this. He says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Right? We got to work out our faith. We don't just show up to church on Sundays, right? We don't just do the one thing, or like I say, this is a process. Like we're supposed to be spending time. And so when we're talking about Lent, let me just go back to the text for a second. Verse 17 says, "For my part, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you." So covenants, Pastor Robin probably talked about covenants last week. Like this whole kind of series is a lot about covenants. And so there's two basic kinds of covenants. There's conditional and unconditional covenants in the Bible. So like an unconditional covenant is much like a marriage, right? Like when we stand up and we give our vows, at church, it's I'm doing this, right? I wouldn't tell my wife, I promise to love you and cherish you as long as. You don't get to say that in the marriage, right? You don't get to say as long as, right? This is what I vow to do. They're vows, right? So that's kind of an unconditional. But then conditional would have a lot of if-then statements, right? It's a little more contractual. So it's like, if you do this, then you'll do this. So those are the two different kinds of covenants in the Bible. So then jump down to Genesis 7. And if you're like, what does this have to do with Lent, Carson? We're getting there. Genesis 7:17. For 40 days, right, there's our 40, right? Or for 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth. And as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. And so in Lent, so when we're thinking about Noah and Lent, so there's this 40-day period, and so for 40 in the Bible is a time of trial and temptation, right, and preparation. And so in Lent, right, we're kind of aligning ourselves with the Jesus in the wilderness, right? Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted and prepared for his ministry and for heading to the cross, right? And so that's what we're doing in Lent, right? We're preparing ourselves, and we're heading towards Easter, right? We're heading towards the cross, and so that's. But it's an examination time that we go, am I living in a way that I should expect a flood? Right, that's what we can do in these 40 days. Am I living in such a way that I should expect a flood, or am I living in such a way that I'm bringing honor and glory to God who saved me? Am I living that way? Let me go to Genesis 8:15. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so that they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." So Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. And then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. I always wonder, like, that bird made it all the way through the flood, and just the first day back, I was like, the poor bird. But that's not the point of the story. The thing that's important here, is that it wasn't just Noah that was on the boat, right? So the story, like, God is speaking to Noah, but it's because of the way that Noah lived his life, his whole family was saved, right? And so that means that we can, as individuals or as parents, or we can live in such a way that we can either stop generational sin or we can start generational sin, right? We can have that kind of effect on our families. The way that we choose to live will impact them, right? Like, and so for me, like, I had to, like, there were some generational curses that I had to get rid of, right? That my dad passed on to me. And it was like, so I could be, hey, I could be an abusive husband, and I could be an absent father, right? Those lined up for me. I could see it. It's very easy for me to be that, because that's who my dad was. But I had to choose, right? I had to look at my kids and go, am I going to live in such a way that I should expect a flood, or am I going to live in such a way, right, that I bring glory and honor, and I put an end to generational sin in my family, right? And so we can do that. But right at the end, did you see what? So there was, Noah built an altar to the Lord, taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds. He sacrificed burnt offerings on it, right? He worshiped. That's worship. So he gets out, he goes, it's worship, and it's also Easter, because it's death and resurrection. It's like everything was wiped away, and then there's new life and all these things. So there's this, it's a thanksgiving, right? We worship out of thanksgiving. Like, I worship because when I worship God, I'm always thinking about, like, who I could have been. Like, who did God save me from being? Right? Like, that's where my praise comes from. It's like, God, thank you so much. Not just from saving me from eternally, but here, you saved me from being someone that would destroy his own family. Our souls should kind of echo Psalm 40, where David said, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. You see, we worship. We worship because God lifted us out of the muck and the mire. He lifted us out of the storm. He is our ark. He is the one that rescues us. I'm almost done. Genesis 9, verse 16. Says, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on earth. So every covenant has a sign. Right? They all have signs, like weddings, right? Marriages, we have rings. And so in the church, we have the Lord's table, communion. We have the ichthys, right? The Jesus fish. There's like we have the cross, right? We have crosses all over the world because it's a symbol of a covenant that God did. But one of the things I loved, and I think we did this probably when me and my family first started visiting here. I'd never heard of it before. But remember your baptism. That was so new to me, and I loved it. I thought this is so cool, right? Because it's a way for you kind of to think back to exactly what you were saved from, right, and what God took you out of, right? And so that's what I want to do that today. So and this is the Peter passage. I loved it. In chapter 3:20, it said, "To those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into the heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him." And so I'm just going to pray. And I'm going to invite you, I think Hal might play something, and I'm going to invite you to just come forward and just touch the water. And take a moment to think about your baptism. If you can't remember your baptism, you can think about all that God has done for you and who you could have been and who you are in him. Let me pray.